The galaxy remembers Orks for their savagery, their endless hunger for battle, their crude brutality that leaves worlds broken and skies burning. But few outside the cloisters of the Mechanicus or the vaults of the Ordo Xenos ever truly consider what happens when that crude ferocity collides with the most dangerous relics of the past. For when an Ork warband stumbles upon the technology of a dead empire or the secrets of a forbidden forge, what follows is never a simple tale of ruin. It is an unraveling where the laws of physics themselves groan beneath the weight of their misuse. This is the story of what the Greenskin Horde does when it lays its hands upon the creations of powers far older, far more careful, and far more terrible than itself. And in that story, the galaxy trembles, for the Orks are too stupid to fear what they should fear most, and too cunning to fail to make use of it. If you want to see more explorations of the hidden and horrifying corners of Warhammer 40k's lore, make sure to support this channel by sharing, subscribing, and joining us as we venture deeper into the darkness of the Imperium and beyond. The dust storms rose first, sweeping across the dead world in waves that stung exposed flesh and gnawed at metal alike. To the human settlers who had once walked here, they had been omens of decay, warning signs that their fragile colony was doomed. To the Orks, who arrived centuries later, in a guttural tide of smoke-belching landers and ramshackle dropcraft, the storms meant nothing. They crashed through the skies without thought for weather or terrain, slamming into sand and stone alike, bellowing war cries that shook the dunes. And when the dust settled, the scavenging began. Orks never saw ruins as relics to be preserved. They saw them as puzzles, obstacles, toys. Beneath the surface of this forsaken world lay the skeleton of a civilization far older than the Imperium itself. The Greenskins did not know its name, did not care to. All they knew was that the ground rang hollow beneath their boots, and that hollow meant treasure. The first to dig were the grots, bullied into the task by kicks and lashes. They squealed as they hauled rusted spades and scavenged drills into the sand, but fear did not matter. The Orks wanted holes, and so holes appeared. Within days, the dunes broke open, revealing a stairwell descending into blackness. It was no Ork structure, nor was it anything human hands had shaped. The walls were cut with geometric precision, too perfect, too smooth, bearing sigils that twisted the eye if stared at too long. To the Adeptus Mechanicus, it would have been a site of immediate sanctity, worthy of cordons, prayers, and quarantines. To the Orks, it was simply a place to stomp into, bellowing for a fight that never came. Down into the depths they went, torches flickering, crude lamps casting shadows across walls that seemed to shiver when touched. The Orks laughed at the silence. They beat at the walls with their boots and fists, daring anything to rise and challenge them. Nothing did. What they found instead were the remnants of machines that had slept for millennia. Rows of metallic constructs, skeletal and incomplete, their forms corroded but still thrumming faintly with alien power. To Orks, the sight was irresistible. One tore a limb from its socket, grinning as sparks leaped from the joint. Another pried a crystalline shard from a console and held it aloft like a trophy. The Mekboy who led them, a broad-shouldered brute named Groxod, pushed past his bellowing kin with eyes wide, not with caution, but with greed. Groxod had no words for what he saw. To him, this was not the tomb of an ancient race, not a place of reverence or fear. It was a workshop waiting for his hands. He barked orders, and the Orks obeyed, dragging out components that weighed tons, hauling engines that still wept faint light from runes etched in their cores. The air grew heavy with dust and the bitter temps of ozone. Pipes hissed, chambers collapsed, yet still they dragged and looted, their laughter filling halls that had not known sound for ages. Each fragment was a treasure, not because they knew its use, but because they believed it must have one. Above the sands, the camp transformed into a grotesque parody of an Imperial dig site. The Orks piled alien machinery in heaps, smashed panels together, and bolted shards of unknown alloys onto their vehicles. Grots scurried with welding torches, screamed at by overseers as sparks flew and alien metals fused beneath their shaking hands. None of it should have worked. The alloys were incompatible, the energy fields unstable. Yet in the haze of Orkish industry, things began to function. A guttural cheer rose when a half-assembled cannon spat lightning across the desert, obliterating a cliff face in a plume of shattered rock. To the Orks, this was proof enough. The relics were not dangerous ruins. They were gifts, waiting to be hammered into weapons of war. The more they built, the stranger the camp became. Structures hummed with stolen energy, half-living circuits twitching beneath Orkish welds. Engines growled with a resonance that no human ear could find tolerable. Even the sand seemed to recoil, blackened where it touched fragments of alien design. But the Orks cared nothing for the corruption that seeped through their crude inventions. They saw only strength. To them, every failure was just another excuse to smash harder. Every explosion, another reason to laugh. One by one, the pieces of a dead empire were pulled, screaming into the present, reshaped by ignorance and belief. What none of them realized was that discovery was never one-sided. The tomb they had unearthed had not been meant to be disturbed. Its silence was not emptiness, but dormancy. As the Orks stripped its halls, as they pried free every crystalline core, something in the deep places stirred. Lights flickered in corridors long collapsed. Echoes rippled through stone, carrying whispers that no Ork ear could hear. Across the galaxy, perhaps, a signal was sent, faint but insistent, a cry that something long buried was awake again. But the Orks would never notice. They had no patience for whispers. They only heard the roar of their machines, the shriek of their guns, the bellow of their joy as relics became loot. And so the looted relic was born, not a singular weapon, not a named artifact, but a collection of fragments, each smashed together by hands too crude to know restraint. It should have been an abomination. It should have been inert. Yet under the weight of Orkish belief, it breathed. The grots whispered in terror of what they had pulled into the light. But the Orks only saw a future, bristling with fire and iron. The first sparks had been struck, and soon the galaxy would feel the flames. Graxod's workshop rose from the desert like a shrine to madness. To Imperial eyes, it would have been a desecration. Alien metals bolted to rusted plating, engines gutted and reassembled into snarling carcasses of machines, sparks leaping through the air in showers that rained over grots screaming at the heat. But to the Orks, it was holy ground. Here, the Mekboy reigned, and in his grease-caked hands, the relics of a long-dead civilization became something new, something louder, something ready for war. The Orks gathered in a crude semicircle around the site, their tusked faces split into grins, watching as Graxod bellowed at his assistants. To them, he was not a tinkerer. He was a prophet. The Mekboy was no scholar of the Omnisci. He had no sacred data slates, no catechisms of ignition or forbidden litanies of power. His blueprints were scratches in the dirt, crude glyphs drawn with a boot or a bloodied finger. His tools were mismatched, scavenged from wreckage and looted manufactorums, wrenches too large for human hands, arc torches spitting flame, hammers slick with grime. Yet somehow, impossibly, his machines functioned. Orks would say it was because he was clever. Humans who had studied their kind would whisper of the gestalt field that bound every Ork together, the unconscious psychic energy that made the impossible real so long as enough of them believed in it. To Graxod, it was simpler. If he could picture it roaring, smashing, killing, then it could be built. And so, he built. He dragged one of the crystalline cores from the tomb into the center of his workshop, the thing pulsing faintly with light, as though reluctant to be woken. Around it, he welded together a frame of scavenged plating, bolting alien alloys onto crude Ork metal until sparks rained like fire. The grots screamed and cursed as they hauled pieces into place, but the mech drove them harder with kicks and barks. He worked without sleep, his eyes glowing with the manic intensity that only orcs could summon. Every strike of his hammer, every hiss of welding flame, was accompanied by his guttural laughter. The machine groaned, trembled, and then howled as its alien heart beat in time with orcish belief to the Adeptus Mechanicus. This was heresy of the highest order. Alien technology should have been quarantined, dismantled, or buried beneath prayers to the Omniscient. To the Orks, there was no heresy, only creation. Where the Mechanicus bowed to ritual, Waaagh defied it with grease and brute strength. He pulled apart systems meant to last millennia and forced them into shapes that defied comprehension. He crowned the construct with a cannon so oversized that even a baneblade would have buckled under its weight. He wired consoles, meant for silent thought, into crude orc triggers, levers, and glyphs that only his kind could read. When it flickered to life, when lightning crawled across its surface and the air itself hummed with unnatural resonance, the orcs cheered as if witnessing revelation. The mech's creations were more than weapons. They were acts of faith. Each bolt slammed into place, each jagged weld, was a declaration that the universe. Around him, the tribe began to change. Boys painted glyphs across their armor, crude symbols of the mech's hand daubed in blood and oil. They fought over scraps of alien metal, demanding pieces to bolt onto their guns or stitch into their vehicles. The relics became more than loot. They became sacred, proof that their tribe was blessed with strength no rival could match. The mech himself swaggered among them, his voice rising above the din, promising greater machines, louder explosions, victories that would echo across stars. And the orcs believed. Their belief fed the work, lent weight to his hammer strikes, steadied his manic hands. But not everything bent so easily. Some of the relics resisted, their circuitry snarling like wounded beasts when pried apart. Energy flared in bursts that melted steel and charred flesh. Grats vanished in flashes of green fire, leaving only shadows seared into stone. Yet for every accident, the orcs only laughed louder. They did not see failure, only spectacle. To them, each explosion was a promise of what the weapon might yet do, if struck harder, if built bigger, if fed enough blood and metal. Where others would have abandoned the effort in fear, the mech pressed forward, convinced that the louder the resistance, the greater the prize when it finally submitted. And so the relics changed. What had once been artifacts of precision, crafted by hands that sought elegance and order, became twisted monstrosities of iron and fury. A sleek crystalline engine became a growling generator belching smoke. A weapon of silent annihilation became a cannon that roared like a wounded beast with every discharge. The orcs did not care what purpose the relics had served before. In Waagh's hands, they served only one, to kill, and to kill spectacularly. By the time the mech unveiled his creation, the desert trembled with anticipation. The orcs gathered in their thousands, bellowing for the moment the machine would roar. The grats scurried away from its shadow, their eyes wide with terror. Waaagh climbed atop the construct, his frame silhouetted against the night sky, and raised his hammer high. Sparks danced across the machine, its alien heart pulsing with unnatural light, wires hissing like serpents. The air was thick with ozone and smoke, and the orcs' roars became deafening. This was the mech's handmade manifest, not order, not reason, but belief hammered into steel. What emerged from his workshop was no longer a relic. It was a weapon reborn in orcish image, a monument to the madness of a race that could make the impossible real. The galaxy would call it heresy. The orcs called it glory. The night of the test was louder than any battle the Ash Plains had seen in centuries. The orcs had dragged Waagh's creation out from the smoke-stained workshop, its bulk groaning on wheels too crude for its weight. Sparks fell from its undercarriage as alien alloys shrieked against orc steel. But the mech only bellowed with pride, his voice rising above the din. Around him, Thousands of boys surged in a tide of green muscle and roaring voices, their chants shaking the ground itself. To them, this was not a trial. It was a celebration, a rite of proof. A contraption might look impressive. It might hum and growl, but until it spoke with fire on the battlefield, it was nothing. The plains themselves were a graveyard, a wasteland of cracked stone and soot, where once a mining colony had stood. The air was thick with ash, choking and bitter on the tongue. Imperial surveyors had long ago written the planet off as worthless, a place for exile and scrap, scavenging, but to the Orks, it was perfect. Here was a wide killing field, where fire could bloom and wreckage could scatter. The horizon glowed faintly with the wrecks of their own crash-landed craft, now little more than sources of scrap and fuel for the endless fire pits. Into this stage, Graxod's machine rolled, belching smoke as if eager to announce itself. The weapon was no single form, but a stitched-together monstrosity. Plates of alien alloy groaned against Ork steel. Crystal shards glimmered where grots had forced them into sockets, too large or too small. And at its heart the crystalline core pulsed like a living thing. The cannon that crowned it snarled as though already hungry, its barrel long enough to cast a shadow that cut across the camp. The mech clambered onto its frame, his eyes glowing with manic satisfaction, and raised a crude lever hammered from bone and metal. "This one's gonna be loud," he roared, and the Orks howled their approval. The first shot tore the night in half. Lightning screamed from the cannon, a jagged lance of energy that carved across the ash plains and slammed into a distant cliff. The stone ignited, not shattered, not crumbled, but ignited as if turned into fuel by the sheer alien violence of the shot. The cliffside burned with colors no human eye could comfortably watch. Hues that shimmered between worlds, and then collapsed into molten slag. The Orks cheered as though they had seen a god bleed. They stamped their boots, they fired their own crude shooters into the air. They bellowed the mech's name, but Ork tests are never controlled, where humans might run diagnostics, measure heat thresholds, or check structural integrity. The Orks only demanded more. Again, they cried, and Graxod obliged. The machine roared again, its cannon vomiting another shriek of impossible fire. This time the weapon juddered, panels snapping, sparks bursting from seams, and a grot was flung screaming into the night as a conduit exploded. The boys howled with laughter. The death was no deterrent. To them, it was spectacle, proof that the weapon was alive, unruly, and glorious. The louder it broke, the more real it became. Shot after shot followed, each more unpredictable than the last. Sometimes the cannon fired true, blasting apart the ruins of the mining colony in eruptions that painted the sky in fire. Sometimes it faltered, vomiting arcs of energy that leaped sideways, slicing through mobs of Orks and leaving smoking corpses sprawled in the ash. Yet even then, the survivors roared approval. For an Ork, being killed by a machine so powerful that it could not be tamed was not dishonor. It was privilege. To die beneath such fire was to be part of its legend. As the test raged on, the weapon seemed to awaken, its alien heart pulsing faster, its crystals glowing brighter. The Orks' belief poured into it like fuel, and what should have collapsed into ruin instead surged into further life. The cannon grew louder, its discharges tearing through the fabric of the plains themselves, leaving craters that hissed with unnatural light. The ground shook, the air screamed with resonance, and even the grots dared to believe that the machine could not fail. It was not only the Orks who noticed. Across the plain, deep in the tunnels that had once belonged to the miners, shadows stirred. Sensors blinked awake in the ruins of old defense systems. Systems that had lain dormant for centuries until something older still had roused them. Strange echoes whispered through the air. Transmissions broken and garbled but undeniable in their intent. Something was awake that should not be. The Orks never saw it. They had no ears for whispers, no patience for omens. All they cared for was the spectacle of their mech's hand proving itself in the crucible of fire. When the cannon finally overloaded, shrieking with a pitch so high it tore the ears from nearby crowds, the blast that followed was apocalyptic. The sky itself seemed to tear open, clouds shredded in an expanding ring of fire. The orcs were hurled from their feet, their laughter turning to thunderous cheers as they clawed themselves upright. Groxod stood atop his creation, singed, bleeding, his grin so wide it split his face. The machine still stood, half melted, groaning, but alive. That was all that mattered. Efficiency was meaningless. Control was meaningless. What mattered was that it had roared louder than any weapon they had known, that it had killed, destroyed, and lit the plains aflame. The orcs had witnessed proof, and proof was all they needed. In that moment, the first ripple spread. Across the stars, Auspex arrays flickered with readings they could not explain. Administratum clerks marked anomalies and void traffic, and astropaths whispered of strange echoes clawing at their minds. The orcs would never know, never care. Their contraption had lived its first night of war, and that was all that mattered to them. But for the galaxy, it was the beginning of a disaster that would not end with the Ash Plains. The Ash Plains never fell silent after that night. Where once they had been a dead world, marked only by abandoned mines and drifting ash. Now they pulsed with the roar of engines and the bellow of orcs. Groxod's creation had survived its first trial, and in surviving it, had become something more than a weapon. The boys no longer called it Da, Big Gun, or Dat, Fing Wat Shoots. They gave it a name, a guttural bark repeated in unison, until the desert itself seemed to echo with it. Scraps. To the orcs, the name itself carried weight. A sign that the machine was not just steel and fire, but a living totem of their strength. It began with glyphs. The first were crude daubs of paint smeared across plates and helmets. Rough copies of the symbols Groxod had scrawled on the machine's frame during its construction. But belief is contagious among orcs, and soon entire mobs bore the mark. Armor was daubed, banners were raised, even weapons were painted, until the air above the camp was a riot of symbols, declaring loyalty not just to the mech, but to his creation. The boys roared louder, fought harder, every skirmish fueled by the idea that they carried a piece of Scrapscrogga into battle. And something in the air shifted. The orc's psychic field, always simmering with violence and belief, swelled. It crackled through the camp like static before a storm. Grats whimpered beneath it, their teeth chattering, their eyes rolling white as if the sheer pressure of orcish faith pressed down upon their spines. Machines sputtered into life without touch. Engines turned over with no fuel. Weapons that had jammed for years suddenly spat fire again, as if unwilling to defy the belief that surrounded them. Reality itself bent under the weight of their conviction. Groxod basked in it. He strutted through the camp, grease dripping from his fists, his tusks stained with blood from endless fights. His machine was no longer a contraption. To him it was proof that he was chosen, and the more the orcs believed, the stronger his work became. Scrapscrogga no longer needed careful maintenance. Panels that should have buckled under the strain held firm. Cables that should have melted under overload glowed with steady light. The cannon at its crown snarled louder, its charge faster, as though the orc's faith itself fed its alien core. It was not just the machine that changed. The warband itself began to swell. Raiders from distant wastes caught wind of the weapon and came in droves, their vehicles belching smoke, their voices raised in challenge and awe. Clans that would have fought one another to the death instead gathered shoulder to shoulder, unified by the promise of fire and glory. Where once a single mech had a following, now a true Waaagh stirred, not yet vast enough to burn sectors, but growing, swelling. Each new recruit another voice added to the psychic storm. On the battlefield, the effect was unmistakable. When Scrapscrogga was wheeled into place, even rival orcs stopped fighting for a heartbeat, staring with wide, greedy eyes. And then the roar came, and the weapon spat its impossible fire. The blast alone tore apart anything in its path: fortifications, armored columns, even the earth itself. But the real terror lay in what followed. Orks, who had been faltering, surged forward, their wounds forgotten, their morale unbreakable. They bellowed the weapon's name as if it were a war cry, charging through walls of fire with laughter on their lips. No matter how many fell, no matter how many were cut down, the tide only grew stronger. The Imperium would record it as madness. Field reports spoke of Orks charging into artillery barrages without slowing, of machines refusing to die no matter how many times they were struck, of weapons that should have exploded holding together through sheer refusal. They could not understand that the weapon was more than steel. It was faith made manifest, a focus for Orkish belief so strong that the fabric of reality bent to it. In truth, it did not matter if Scrapscrogga truly functioned as it appeared. Enough Orks believed it did, and that belief made it real. Whispers spread beyond the ash plains. Astropaths screamed of psychic echoes rippling across the void, echoes that carried with them not the words of demons, but the laughter of Orks. Imperial commanders debated whether such things were even possible, whether crude technology could amplify a species' gestalt field to such extremes. The Mechanicus spoke of heresy, of alien corruption, twisting archaeotech into unstable conduits. Others whispered that perhaps the machine was not powered by technology alone but by the warband itself, by the collective roar of thousands of Orks demanding that it live. The Orks, of course, asked no such questions. For them, the proof was simple. Scrapscrogga killed louder than anything else, and it brought victory wherever it was dragged. That was enough. They painted its glyphs across ruined cities, carved its name into the husks of enemy tanks, daubed it in blood across their own skin. It became a banner under which rival clans marched together, their endless squabbles set aside in favor of bigger wars, brighter explosions, louder deaths. And still, the psychic storm grew. The Grots swore they could hear it, a constant hum that clawed at their ears, the sound of reality itself fraying at the edges. Some boys began to dream of the machine, waking with their fists clenched in their mouths shouting its name. Others claimed to see it in visions, towering larger than mountains, striding across the stars like a god of steel and fire. Whether these were hallucinations, omens, or simply the echo of belief feeding back upon itself, none could say. But to the Orks, it meant only one thing. Their Waaagh was unstoppable. The desert was no longer ash and ruin. It was alive, throbbing with the pulse of Orkish faith, the ground scarred with tire tracks and stained with blood. Above it all loomed Scrapscrogga, its cannon humming, its alien heart glowing brighter with every cheer, every fight, every drop of belief poured into it. What had begun as a looted relic had become something more, a miracle of war, a weaponized prayer, a totem of an entire race's refusal to be denied. The echoes spread long after the Waaagh had rolled on. For the Orks, the ash plains were already forgotten. Just another battlefield trampled under boots and treads, left behind in search of louder wars and fresher foes. They carried their glyphs, their painted faith, their memories of Scrapscrogga, but they did not look back. They never did. For the Imperium, for the Eldar, for any who passed through that cursed world afterward, the memory was not so easily abandoned. The land itself bore scars no weapon of man should have been able to carve. Craters pulsed with residual light that bled through the soil. Fragments of stone hummed with energies that had no source. Vox signals dissolved into static across whole continents, as if the planet itself groaned in the aftermath of the Orks' meddling. In time, explorers came. Some were Imperial surveyors, dispatched by administratum orders that had no understanding of what awaited them. Some were inquisitorial envoys, silent and watchful. Scribes scratching notes into data slates while their masters muttered prayers against contamination. And some were scavengers, human, alien, mercenary drawn by whispers of impossible weapons forged by crude green hands. Few returned, fewer still returned, saying, the relics the Orks had left behind, half-welded engines and twisted shards of alien alloy, were not dead. They thrummed faintly, pulsing as though remembering the Orkish belief that had once animated them. To touch them was to invite ruin. Servitors malfunctioned near them. Voxlings spat laughter where no laughter should be. Astropaths recoiled, clutching their heads as visions of crude green glyphs seared across their minds. The galaxy began to feel the ripples. Void routes near the world flickered with instability. Ships charting passage past its orbit reported sudden bursts of static that froze entire cogitator arrays. Some claimed to see vast shadows in the warp around the planet, not demonic, not shaped by chaos, but crude and brutal, like the imprint of Orkish thought pressed into the fabric of the Imperium. Such things should have been impossible. They were impossible, and yet the evidence was undeniable. And this was only one world, only one weapon, across the galaxy. The story repeated itself in countless variations. An Ork warband, stumbling across a Necron Gauss matrix, hammering it into a cannon that shattered entire cities before detonating in green fire that poisoned the soil for centuries. A tribe looting Eldar Wraithbone, reshaping it into crude armor that screamed with every strike, leaving behind fragments that whispered in the tongues of the dead long after the Orks had left. Orks tearing open ancient Imperial vaults, dragging archaeotech engines into the light, forcing them to roar again with welds and grease until they collapsed into singularities that tore holes in void lanes and devoured fleets whole. Each time, the Orks moved on. They did not linger to study, to reflect, to understand. Their lives were endless motion, endless battle, endless hunger for louder explosions and brighter fires. When the weapon burned out, when it imploded, when it tore the fabric of reality wide open, they simply laughed and sought the next fight. The galaxy, however, could not move on so easily. The scars lingered. Sectors were rendered uninhabitable. Warp storms flared where none had been before, seeded by the Orks' careless manipulation of forces they could never comprehend. For the Imperium, these were disasters that no amount of doctrine could prevent. How do you guard against a race that cannot be deterred, that thrives on failure as much as on success? For every Ork weapon that annihilated its own warband, there were 5 more that burned cities before they collapsed. For every failed experiment, there was a triumph that scarred star systems. And the worst part, the part no Inquisitor dared to write aloud, but which every one of them knew, was that the Orks never needed to understand what they had found. Their ignorance was their shield, their madness was their engine. Their belief was enough. The Eldar whispered of it in their craft world halls, mourning how fragments of Wraithbone twisted under crude green hands, warping into echoes of the laughing god's cruelest jests. The Necrons stirred in their tombs, their protocols tightening, their lords seething at the desecration of their sacred weapons. Even the ruinous powers took notice, though whether they laughed or raged could never be known, for Orks cared nothing for chaos, but chaos was fed all the same. Every scream, every misuse, every collapse of order into ruin rippled into the warp, and the dark gods drank deep. In the end, perhaps that is the truest horror of the Orks. It is not their brutality, which can be met with force. It is not their numbers, which can be culled with fire. It is the accidents they leave behind, the relics half-woken, the sectors scarred, the machines twisted into grotesque parodies of their original purpose. Each one a curse cast blindly into the galaxy. Each one a problem that will fester for centuries after the greenskins have moved on. They are a tide that sweeps through, careless, roaring, ignorant, and when it recedes, it leaves behind wreckage more dangerous than the wave itself. Some whisper that this is why the Orks endure, why no extermination has ever succeeded. They are not only a race of war, they are a force of entropy, reshaping what they touch. bending it to their crude vision, and leaving behind ruin that outlasts them. For every battlefield they abandon, 10 more will suffer from what they have left behind. It is not their blades or their guns that mark the galaxy most deeply. It is their echoes, the laughter in the vox, the scars in the warp, the relics that should never have been awoken but were. And somewhere, on some forgotten world, a Mekboyz stands in the ruins of another tomb, his eyes wide, his hands reaching for a relic older than his race, older than the Imperium itself. He does not know what it is. He does not care. All he sees is the promise of fire, the roar of engines, the laughter of his kin. All he sees is possibility, and the galaxy shudders, for it knows what comes next.